My channel hit 100,000 subscribers, so thank you all for supporting the channel. And they sent me one of their, signature plaques, but I didn't want to just put this up on the wall. I wanted to make a project out of this. So after talking to a buddy of mine, decided that I should make the first bullet-resistant play button. Now, over the past few months, I've been trying many different materials and methods to come up with a ballistic panel that's both clear and extremely effective at stopping a 9mm full metal jacket NATO round. And this demo panel here was the final iteration of that research and development process. And I shot it with that same round that I just mentioned, and it only had 1/8 of an inch of penetration and had very localized fracturing, so I could still clearly see that text, making it perfect for me to duplicate into a bigger panel and then attach that to my play button. Now, one thing that I discovered in building a panel in this way with some toughened epoxy interlayers and a polycarbonate basically sandwiching the core, so the front acts as a compression layer and the rear acts as a tension-based layer when it's under that impact, basically turns this into a bit of a ballistic trampoline. Now, don't get me wrong, the backface deformation on these is pretty good. It ends up being about 1/4 inch to maybe 1/2 inch at max, but it snaps back to position so viciously that it ends up chucking that round basically back at where it came from. Each of these hit me with the same round that I fired at them, which is pretty remarkable actually when you consider that that round had to return within just less than a couple inches of where it originated. And the other key piece of this build was this clamp that I designed. I actually sent this off to PCBWay to have them manufacture out of solid steel to really help pull this whole assembly together. Now, I did a video on some 3D printed steel lattice structures to make some super armor, and I placed the ballistic footage earlier on in that video, and folks were quite receptive to that. So if you came to just see this button get shot, I'm gonna have that for you right here so you can get back to watching whatever else you want. And then for those folks who are curious on how I actually built this whole thing and my whole panel build process and materials there, that's the later portion of this video after those tests. And for my disclaimer, do not try this at home. This is not to be replicated. All firing was done in a safe manner on legal premises. But with that out of the way, let's shoot this play button. Right there's good. So it is 7 degrees outside and we are warming up our hands before going out to do the test. I've got this set up here with some foam. This way if it falls down, it doesn't get scratched on the surface because I would still like to hang this up after we shoot it. Let's go ahead and stand a little closer here. Okay. 9mm full metal jacket. All right. I'm gonna be firing shortly. Go ahead and get the zoom in on the plate.
Yep.
Oh, it hit me right on the knuckle.
Oh my god.
Right there's where that round hit me. Hold on. It's drawing blood too.
Oh my god.
Yeah. Hold on a second.
You okay?
You can keep filming. Hold on. I'm gonna get the round of that chamber first. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. These plates always chuck the round back. That's the second time I've been hit by these plates.
Yep.
But let's go ahead and look at this guy. So we can see here, absolutely stopped it, and the play button is... Oh, it actually did. It actually pushed out the back a little bit here. Yeah, pushed out the back a little bit.
I mean, the button looks intact though.
Yeah, yeah. But let me go ahead and open this up. There's no round in the chamber, but letting folks see that.
It is dang cold.
But anyways, so yeah, did awesome. My play button does not look wrecked. That's something I was worried about, was actually having the play button get cracked or pushed around. So
it looks...
Yep.
You can even see the stratification of
it.
I don't think so.
There it is. So looking closely at the impact, you can see a little bit of localized fracturing here, but that did not continue all the way through like with some of the earlier iterations where the acrylic actually completely broke apart into discrete chunks. The difference here is a thin layer of polycarbonate on the surface, and it did actually delaminate a good bit of the surrounding epoxy, and that actually allowed a little bit of a gap to form where you can see some scattering of a couple small pieces of lead from the round coming off. So again, out of all my iterations, this was the final iteration that was good enough for me to implement into here. So these are the same mix, and we can see that the impact is almost identical. They both popped off a large chunk of that center polycarbonate, have a similar fracturing pattern. Now the actual thickness of this pane is 27mm, and traditional ballistic glass rated for 9mm, it's typically about 1 to 1.2 inches, so for reference there, an inch is 24mm. Now on that topic of commercial ballistic glass, it is also done in layers, just like other ballistic armors, where the harder materials are out front to help blunt the round, with the more impact resistant panels behind that. So typically the outer facing layers are chemically treated glass, which is also the same as Gorilla Glass. So you might be familiar with that. That's just a trademarked brand type thing. But chemically treated glass is basically a pane that has been submerged in a molten salt bath. The goal here is to swap out the smaller sodium ions for larger potassium ions. What that does is it creates compressional force on that layer, and the depth that that exchange process is able to permeate into the panel is referred to as depth of layer. So all of the outer surfaces that are exposed to the salt bath are put under compression stress, whereas now the inner panel is put under tensile stress. And this is basically where the system is at equilibrium and makes it very strong. Now that compressive layer is on the order of 30 to 300 microns. Now that depth is important because that number decides the optimal impact resistant to the thickness of the glass. So if we have a depth of layer that is 150 microns, well, we've got two sides, so that means that you have about 300 microns of depth total, which means that your tensile layer should be, it ends up actually you want about 60% of the pane to be under tensile strength. So that would be 450 microns for that core, meaning your overall thickness is 750 microns, which is 0.75 millimeters, which is really thin to be effective against a round. So typically they do make it quite thicker. So you're looking at a few millimeters actually of this chemically treated glass. And then those are added up via interlayers like TPU or PVB to lock them together. Then behind all of that, you'd have your typical polycarbonate. Now, as far as my design goes, that glass is way too expensive for me to use and it's hard to work with, so I didn't want to go through iterating with that. So this left me with two primary material choices, being acrylic and then polycarbonate. Now, acrylic is around 17 times stronger than annealed glass, whereas polycarbonate is about 250 times stronger. Now, strength is a term that blends up a lot of different metrics like impact resistance, its ability to flex under stress, hardness, and things like that. So while not being as hard as chemically treated glass, which is about 5 to 6 on the Mohs hardness scale, acrylic is about 3.5 and polycarbonate is about a 3. So acrylic is actually harder than polycarbonate is. Acrylic also has a light transmission of about 92%, whereas polycarbonate is only 82%. This is an example showing pure polycarbonate. You can see that it is visibly less clear and has a little bit of a bluish tint to it. Now, metrics-wise, polycarbonate sounds way better than acrylic, but my panels actually performed better by having the acrylic up front because it was having a lot less backface deformation. Polycarbonate's pretty flexible, and so the round tends to tunnel into it and cause a lot of backface deformation. So again, by having the acrylic in the center, you're having more clarity by boosting the light that's able to enter into this panel, and you're also giving a much harder backstop, which is why you can see it cracked through the polycarbonate and then shattered on the surface of this acrylic, where the then backer is able to properly support the acrylic so it doesn't shatter all the way through. And as for the steel frame, I did design this and send it to PCBWay, who is also sponsoring this video, and they did a great job. So this is actually my first CNC'd part for one of my projects, and they did a really nice job. All of the lines came out extremely clear, especially these inner corners. That's typically a hard thing to do for CNC machines because it's a router based, but they got them extremely tight. So I'm very impressed with that. And they also did some sort of tumbling or sandblasting to smooth down the parts. I'm definitely going to be using that service in the future for more projects. So I was very excited to get this. Obviously, it ended up adding a lot of extra flair while being a functional and very strong clamp for this play button. And then below this, I did install a rubber gasket that I cut out of a thin sheet. Basically, that's allowing me to have a very even pressure when I clamp this down and also allow a little bit of give when you're doing the impact, because these are all hard surfaces, and when you're hitting it with a round, you want to have a little bit of give in there such that it's not so brutal on the actual chassis itself. And the rubber, of course, has a high coefficient of friction, so when you clamp this down, that plate wasn't going anywhere, even without the actual spacers in place. And now these I also printed out of polycarbonate, and I did paint them gray because I only had black filament. But I did add a little bit of accents to this to make the design pop a little bit more and look pretty neat when I hang it up on the wall. Now, as for the adhesive selection, I tried a bunch of different epoxies and glues. Another solid option was DP100. That one ended up being pretty good, and that's a natively clear epoxy as well. But I ultimately settled on mixing up my own ratio of a toughened epoxy mix and using that. It ended up with a bit of a reddish tint, which isn't a big deal. I mean, when you're putting these layers together, they're flat panels under a lot of pressure, so the layers of the adhesive is extremely thin, so you don't get any of that color actually showing through your part. So the first panels I did, I started with my pressure clamp, which I showed on here a little while ago. When it comes to adhesives, it did not work well at all. It was doing an uneven spread and the bubbles weren't given a clear route to escape. So that's no good. So I ended up using a vacuum process. So after mixing, I did degas all of my epoxy before laying it on the glass. But the first panel that I did in the vacuum bag revealed two things. So one, I didn't have enough airflow around the part, so you ended up getting a lot of draw from one area. And I was also able to detect that that happened because there was still a lot of air bubbles in the mix that were all making a pattern out the front. So overall, the process was wiping each panel with isopropyl alcohol to get it totally clean. I then mixed up my epoxy, degassed that, wiped it onto the part, then degassed the actual panel itself, which required me to get a bigger vacuum pot that I could lay on its side. The only thing with that is make sure your lid is centered because these tend to have some overlap, and if your lid's not centered, you might end up with an implosion. So once you have your entire layup now together and it's ready to put in the vacuum bag, I actually used some foam that PCBWay had sent the frame with because that ended up being perfect to put above and below this part. Something to keep in mind with these vacuum bags is they're pretty thin and these panels have sharp edges. So I did sand these parts, but these 90-degree corners and whatnot and edges are still pretty sharp. And when that bag is drawn, you can get a tear and it ends up, of course, ruining the bag. So once the vacuum had stabilized and my part was good, I then actually added some steel plates along with a few ammo cans that were full of ammo on top of that. And that was simply for the reason of just adding more pressure to this plate. Once I had added that, I then actually drew the vacuum again to get any last little bit of air out of that bag. Now, thankfully, I made this table extremely sturdy, so it could hold many, many times that amount of weight. And I also have a video on this too when I was early days of making my workshop, if you wanted to replicate that. So it turns out these play buttons are hollow with a thin piece of metal on the front and the back, but they have a light plastic core with cavities in it. So this by itself isn't strong enough to clamp into the assembly since tightening the bolts on the metal frame would actually crush it. So I drilled into this, modified a syringe, and used some plain old epoxy to inject it full with to basically turn this into a very solid and sturdy backer. So the play button started out at 0.7 pounds neat, and then after I filled it up, it was 1.44 pounds after the injection. So once I bolted everything together, now the play button was officially complete and ready to test. So I hope you guys enjoyed this build, and thanks again for all the support along the way. I never, well, at least I used to not think that I'd ever be a accepted YouTuber. What the heck, dude? Why did I have to burp? I'm debating if I should put that in the video or not. I mean, it is organic. The pun was not intended, but that pun is appreciated. Anyways, until I see you guys again with my next video, which is for the project that I'm currently working on, I will see you in the comments instead. Until then. Yikes. That was a rough outro. But I might even keep it. Might keep it.